In this first roundtable, we're going to be considering Bombay film colour as the product of transnational flows of personnel, technologies, and aesthetic ambitions. We want to explore Bombay both as a centrifugal space that drew in technicians, filmmakers, and materials from all over the world, but also think of Bombay film colour as a centripetal force that had an international impact via its worldwide circulation and popularity. So we have asked all of our participants to bring one object to stimulate discussion, which they are going to speak about for a few moments, a few minutes, before we open up the conversation between ourselves as well as the audience. So before we begin, I'm just going to take a moment to introduce our participants, and then you will not be hearing from me for a little while. So Sarah Street is Professor of Film and Foundation Chair of Drama at the University of Bristol. She has published many books on different aspects of film, including British cinema history, film costume, set design, and, of course, colour. Her numerous award-winning publications in this field include the 2012 Colour Films in Britain, The Negotiation of Innovation, which won the BAFTA Best Monograph Prize. Its follow-up, Colour Films in Britain, The Eastman Colour Revolution from 2021. 2 edited volumes on colour in British film, Colour in the Moving Image, History, Theory, Aesthetics, an archive, and British Colour Cinema, Practice and Theories. Her 2019 volume, Chromatic Modernity, Colour, Cinema and Media of the 1920s, co-authored with Joshua Yumibe, won the SCMS Catherine Singer Kovacs Book Award and the Michael Nelson Prize from the International Association for Media and History. Most recently, she co-edited with Josh Yumibe Global Film Colour, The Monopack Revolution at Mid-Century. I'm going to introduce all the speakers and then I will invite you to come up and present your objects. So Joshua Yumibe is Professor of Film Studies at Michigan State University. He's the author of the 2012 book, Moving Colour, Early Film, Mass Culture, Modernism. Co-author of the 2015 publication Fantasia of Colour in Early Cinema with Giovanni Fossati, Tom Gunning and Jonathan Rosen, and with Sarah Street, the co-author of the multi-award-winning Chromatic Modernity, Colour, Cinema and Media of the 1920s. And most recently with Sarah, he also co-edited Global Film Colour, The Monopack Revolution at Mid-Century, which was published last year. Lalitha Gopalan is an associate professor in the Department of Radio, Television, Film, and affiliate faculty in the Department of Asian Studies and the South Asia Institute. Sorry, I've not put your institution at the University of Texas, Austin, correct?
That's the most important.
Yeah. Her research and teaching interests are in the areas of film theory, feminist film theory, contemporary world cinemas, Indian cinemas, genre film, and experimental film and video. Her essays and books include the 2021 Cinema's Dark and Slow in Digital India, the 2002 book Cinema of Interruptions, Action Genres in Contemporary Indian Cinema, the 2005 BFI Modern Classic volume on Bombay, and the edited volume, The Cinema of India, from 2010. She's also published essays in journals, including Screen, Journal of the Moving Image, Film Quarterly, New Cinemas, Journal of Contemporary Film, and many landmark anthologies. And finally, Philip Cavendish is Professor of Russian and Soviet Film Studies at University College London. His main research interests lie in the visual poetics of cinema and the relationship between film technology and aesthetics. He has published widely on pre-revolutionary Russian cinema, the Soviet avant-garde of the 1920s, and its theories and practice of camera operation, and the history of colour film during the Stalinist era. He is currently working on early Russian and Soviet experiments in the sphere of colour photography. And now you don't have to listen to me anymore, so I'm going to invite our speakers up. Oh no, sorry, you're going to stay there. I'm going to open up the slides. So I will invite Sarah to introduce her object first.
Okay, thank you, Kirsty. Thank you very much. It's great to be here. And yes, it was kind of an interesting challenge in a way to choose one image. And I kind of find this film, Pakisa, really fascinating. It's a really big, huge sort of drama, melodrama, social kind of. It has everything. It's sort of set in the courtesan world, and it looks back to sort of idealising the past, but perhaps is sort of suggesting some sort of future, albeit restricted, for its main heroine, who was played by this really big star, Meena Kumari, who was married to the director. So pardon me if a lot of you know a huge amount about this film, but I'm coming relatively new to it, but really, of course, fascinating in terms of its colour. So why did I choose this image? Well, for those of you who know the film, the feet dyed with the alta dye is a really, really significant part of the film, because it's the heroine, played by Meena Kumari, and at this point in the film, she's on a train journey going to a courtesan sort of house, and where she will be a dancer. And on the train, a stranger, she's asleep, she doesn't see him, but when she wakes up, she finds that he has written a note, and he has said, "Oh, your feet are so beautiful, but you must promise your feet will never touch the ground, and they're sacred, all of this." And of course, there's a huge irony here, because she's actually going to become this dancer in this kind of harem type place, but she doesn't have at that point her anklet bells on, so apparently it would not be known to the guy Salim that this was her profession. So anyway, this image sort of then comes back a bit later in the film, when again by sort of circumstance the couple meet up again, and again we see the feet, and this is exactly where this shot is taken from. So I won't go too much into narrative, but just to say on that point that at the end of the film, of course, there's a real sort of tragic thing, because she is required to dance at this wedding ceremony where Salim, the man who left her the letter, is getting married to somebody else, and she's kind of perturbed and upset by this, and in her dance she upsets this enormous glass chandelier. And of course, then she continues sort of dancing in a very frenetic way, and her feet become bloodied by the glass. So this sort of image, I thought, is obviously so central to the film. I sort of immediately started looking into alta dye, that has obviously religious significance in Hindu culture. It's linked to sort of the idea of sort of purity and sort of everlasting heavenliness sort of thing, which the title Pakisa means as well. It's kind of pure one, which again, it's this sort of irony around the film, and it's the courtesan lifestyle that she hasn't escaped from, but only through this Salim, through marriage. So it's kind of limited in its its engagement with modernity, but nevertheless, this is an important route for her out of this idea. So I thought, yes, this whole thing, natural alta dye, was produced from red lac resin. It's mainly used. It's mainly today replaced with synthetic dyes. It wasn't used. I looked up to see if it was used in silent cinema, tinting and toning, but apparently not. It's mainly used for sort of fashion and textiles. So I thought, again, that's quite interesting, that it's got this sort of intense cultural meaning, but it's got this natural sort of textile dyeing and printing and linked to that sort of industry. So kind of, I'm sure there's people here with interesting sort of ideas about that, perhaps. The focus on the feet and dancing kind of made me kind of think cross-culturally to the Red Shoes, which also has this amazing sort of focus on this kind of dancing, the dance that involves death and mourning, and sort of, a kind of really difficult set of contradictory and perhaps interesting sort of signifiers around the whole idea of what red in this context really is, and I think, elsewhere in the film, colour I thought was fascinating. Sometimes the whole screen is bathed in colour. It was shot in CinemaScope, in one of the first Indian films ever to have that happen, and they borrowed the lenses from MGM. And apparently they weren't working very well, so they complained, and they had to go back, and they were tested in London. And apparently they weren't filming close-ups very well. And this is so interesting because the film has several very extreme close-ups of eyes, and so they're using that. So they actually overcame that, and it meant that for the rest of the production they didn't have to pay for using the scope stuff. And it took ages to produce this film. The production was started in 1953, I think, so it took like nearly 20 years to make this film. So there's all sorts of things, but I guess I'll just, sorry, I don't want to talk too long, but the reason I think I was also interested in it was because I'm interested in the cross-cultural reception of films and how they were distributed and exhibited globally. And so looking into that, I came across a reference to the Liberty Cinema in London, which in 1972 went full out showing Bollywood films located in Southall, and very much playing to the diasporic audience. And this film was really popular, and there's some testimony of somebody remembering seeing this film and thinking it was amazing. I had a sort of quote here. It was. This person was really impressed by this film, and it was mainly an older audience, apparently, that went to it. They thought it was, kind of associated with, I suppose, perhaps this, the audience were older men and many women. The love story, the pathos and nostalgia for even an enclosed Muslim culture was evident. And so it was kind of had an interesting sort of history. And so it got me thinking about, well, how were these films first seen? What happened with the delay that would have happened with a lot of them? I know a lot of films then were seen on VHS. And so there's this whole sort of network of exhibition and distribution I'm sort of very, very fascinated in, and how the films were received when they reached, other cultures, as well as obviously how they were received in India. So maybe I'll stop there, because I'm hoping that other people also have thoughts on this film. If you know the film, there may be. I'm sure there's loads I still don't know about it. But, yeah.
Wonderful, thanks, Sarah. And I think everyone's going to introduce their object, and then we're going to open out for a discussion. I've already written down about 10 questions to ask you. And so next I'm going to invite Josh to present his object.
Well, thank you, and thank you everybody for bringing us. And I cheated a little bit in another one object. I went for 4 stills from the film Sarah by V. Shantharam from 1963. And per Kirsty's earlier introduction, I'm one of those folks who know a lot about film color, but not a lot about Bombay cinema. And so I'm very much here to kind of learn, and I'm super excited by the people that the network has brought together today, and overall to think about Bombay film color, and really about the kind of stakes in reorienting how we think about film and media history and color history away from a kind of global north emphasis into thinking about what does it mean to reorient and think about the different kind of currents that come in and go out. If we place Bombay at a certain kind of center and centrifugal and centripetal kind of place, what does that do to our histories of film and media? I'll also say that kind of in thinking about this film, kind of coming to it, I also had like really helpful conversations with my student Rituja Desmukh and also colleague Swarnavel Eshwaran Pillai, who are both experts on Indian cinema, on Tamil and Marathi cinema, and they helped me think through some of the stuff. So this film, Sarah, is directed by the foundational Marathi filmmaker V. Shantharam, one of the kind of foundational filmmakers based initially in Pune near Bombay, working in Marathi as well as Hindi cinema. This is a later production by him, but one of his first films through his new production company at the time under his own name, Shantharam Films. And it marked his move from Pune to Bombay to produce increasingly Hindi language cinema, something he'd always done, but particularly from my understanding later in his career, he becomes more Hindi-centric. Although some of you may hopefully correct me on some of my history here. But I'll use these kinds of shifting dynamics around color and around Shantram's move to Bombay to think about some questions about the national color in regional cinemas at this time within Indian cinema. Now, the film also stars his third wife, Sandhya, whom he married in 1956, and it's set in the northwestern state of Rajasthan, known for its desert landscapes and colorful clothing and culture, and stereotypically its patriarchal structures, all of which feature in the film, and in various ways are challenged in the film. The title is taken, I believe, from either a village in Rajasthan, or also possibly from the traditional Indian wedding headdress, which also features towards the end of the film. Now, it's not Shantaram's first film in color, as you've just seen from the timeline that was shown on the website. He'd been experimenting with color since the early 1930s. But it's also a work that was celebrated by him in terms of its color, winning the Filmfare Best Cinematography Award that year that it was released. And it was the first year that that award was split to feature the best cinematography in black and white and the best cinematography in color. And so it won the color award in 1963 from Filmfare. Sarah's one of the many productions during this era from the mid-1950s to the early to mid-1960s filmed in Gevacolor. And like most, if not all of these Gevacolor films, it was processed through the Key Laboratory Film Center, Bombay. And like so many Indian productions, the Belgian technician J.F.H. Van der Awara, whose name is listed there, is featured as the kind of color consultant on the film. And I know that there's been increasing kind of like writing about this character, and also obviously about the Film Center Bombay. Now, thinking about the flows of color technologies, materials, personnel, and ideas, there's an obvious centripetal way of looking at these aspects of color flowing into India at the time. The Belgian color stock itself, which was based on German Agfacolor and offered a cheaper working process than Eastman color, though it was more unstable and variable from shot to shot and reel to reel, which at least in the surviving poor video copies that we can see, you can see these kinds of shifts, sometimes within shots themselves. But we can also see centripetal, outward moving forces through the film. With Shantaram's move to Bombay and increasingly from Marathi to Hindi cinema, we can note that Hindi language cinema was expanding dramatically since Indian independence. And in many ways, this calls attention to the complex relations between regional cinemas and filmmakers and what constitutes national cinema within independent India, which I know is a massive topic. It raises questions about what constitutes the national in modernizing India, regionally as well as linguistically, from Marathi to Hindi, from Pune to Bombay and beyond, in the chromatic hues of Gevacolor, which, like other films from this era, are used to construct a national imaginary across regional and cultural differences. And here I want to give a shout out. I'm thinking specifically about the article that Kirsty and Purvi just published, which is just dynamic and amazing, and stakes out some really impressive methodological territory. I was reading it yesterday on the flight down, and yeah, was really struck by this. But that's about the film Pamposh and the use of Gevacolor there to image the chromatic landscapes of Kashmir, asserting national dominance over regional conflicts in that region. Here too, in Sarah, in this Hindi language film by a Marathi filmmaker, we see an epic portrayal of the stereotypical exotic landscapes of Rajasthan, which is both pre-modern and also modernizing into the national imaginary within this film. This modernizing aspect plays out through the genre blender of the film, from epic melodrama with epic battle scenes with camels, to romance, again, with camels, to comedy and tragedy, and of course musical numbers where Sandhya, the lead performer, really shines. The film is a kind of Romeo and Juliet story. Two star-crossed lovers from opposing tribes, Sandhya as Angara in love with Vikram, who die tragically at the end. While playing out against a conservative patriarchal power structure, it also challenges this through Sandhya's performance as the tomboy child of the leader of her tribe. And there are many scenes debating the advancing roles of women within the modernizing state. And I'm thinking also about what Sarah just said about her selection about the place of gender within these color melodramas and films from this period to kind of mark shifting dynamics around gender within India. And there are lots of amazingly chromatic costume changes marking these various kinds of shifts. And I'll simply end now by noting that the end of the film, which this final shot is taken from, plays out, again, kind of maybe cross-culturally in dialogue with David O. Selznick's 1946 epic Duel in the Sun, another film that stages in remarkable color the melodramatic traumas of a modernizing wilderness where our tragic lovers die, like Angara and Vikram here, who die in one another's bloodied arms in an unrelenting yet beautiful desert landscape. This marks just some of the centripetal and centrifugal movements of color through the landscape, region, and performance in Shantarams. Sarah. So,
wonderful. Thank you so much, Josh. Fabulous. And next, I will invite Lalitha to introduce her object.
Yes. Hi. So, can you hear me?
Want to come a little bit here?
Couldn't tell. Nobody was really using. So, I thank you, Ranjani, for inviting me. Thank you, Kirsty. Nice to meet you. And thanks to Purvi. My own interests, I should say, are primarily in cinematography in this material condition. So for me, I feel like a bit of an interloper into the color, but I'm decided why not. So there are two levels of interloping. I will actually sort of point out, I will get to the end of the Bombay-ness of the everything, but I actually wanted us to move a little out of the Bombay-centric and to think of Bombay as having other networks. So there are two reasons for this. One is it's not the Hindi language cinema. I'm not interested particularly in that realm of what happens to the product, but I'm interested in notions of processing and because film processing is one of and then what happens, and we can leave this open, what happens in the age of digital preservation of films that were processed during the analog, okay? And I say this because around 2013, in the Bombay, and we have somebody here locally, the labs were shuttering. So there is that sort of the studio products were shuttering, but I'll come back to the end on this. Two matters. One is Tarzan Goes to India, 1962, shot in Metro color. So the processing takes place, of course it's shot using Bombay personnel, but the processing takes place in America. So this is something that we have to constantly talk about, because you can have rushes, but you only have rushes after, it's not like digital production. So you only see the rushes later, and it all depends on what the lab liquids are and what temperature, etc. So all of this is also the preoccupation of one of the great American avant-garde filmmakers for me, Morgan Fisher's work, in terms of sort of thinking about how one thinks about color being projected. So for me, and then what happens to preservation. So, and especially around red and magenta, for example, Joshua's color, I thought like, oh God, how ghastly that looks. It's one thing to think you want to work on it, and then how ghastly it looks. So the preservation is sort of so anyway, there's a question of the lab and where one does it. And this is where the difference between the first world and the global south will immediately happen, because why couldn't Metro color be processed in India? No, they had to take it back over there. So this whole habit of shooting and color and processing somewhere else happens even today with filmmakers who are obsessed with analog processing. And I won't pick up names because some of us know some of these filmmakers, but they do. They'll say, I only want to send it to Berlin to process. And whereas I know Berlin-based filmmakers who would prefer to process in India because it's cheaper to process in India. So that this would be in the independent and the artisanal filmmakers. So there's that. So this is the studio history. The second thing is I wanted to actually make a case that you cannot have a Bombay film color without thinking about the other major industry, which happens to be in Madras, Chennai. Because this is where you can't imagine not having a discussion, because we're actually talking about, by the time we hit the 70s, Prasad becomes the most important laboratory and if you level the material conditions, there is really no difference between Manikal Siddheshwari and a popular film made popular film made in Madras in Tamil language or any of the other. So in a way, it levels the playing field between a film that really is like amazing and a very important film in the art house circuit and some kind of popular but not so popular and commercially box office, not really a disaster, but they can all be put together because they share the same bath waters of the film. So how does it matter? What about, the narrative content really doesn't really matter, the representations don't matter for me. So anyway, so I want to sort of make a case for that. So Na Mere War, which is We Too, which is AVM's first color film in 1947. And that, for political reasons, it's the time of independence. I'm less interested in that. What is interesting is that it's the black and white film which has sequences in color. So that is what is interesting about Na Mere War. And this escape, and it's like, oh yeah, look at that. And it's a film which is set in the kind of gambling film industry. Like, here are two sort of, what do we call deadbeats, trying to make a living out of gambling on film production. So, and part of the sequence, and of course it has Kamla, who's this amazing national dancer. So there are other details which I'm less interested in. But what is interesting is precisely the practice of mixing black and white and color. For me, that is sort of interesting. And that is at the level of the projection, right? It's not the level of bathwater, it's the level of projection. So this is a whole nother. And the other is Sridhar's film. And I'm particularly fond of Sridhar's comedies because Sridhar had, I would say, a kind of, how does one say? Kind of liberal relationship to color. Okay, and if you see any of the Sridhar's films, they're precisely that. They're all kind of like pink and funny. I think it's precisely that. You're trying to figure out the aesthetics of color, okay? And you're moving in from black and white to color, and you're figuring out what is going to look great for depth of field and others. And then you land up actually shooting in Ooty, which is the sort of hill station. And you've got roses and somebody wearing pink sari, and then it's green, and then it's dry. So all of these are actually rather difficult to think of depth of field and color, etc. And then, of course, the best part of it all, which could be sort of like a Shantaram film as well, is the color processing of red, which starts leaking and leaking and leaking. And it's just this fantastic, funny color that shows up. And we think that is what Indian cinema and Bollywood looks like, but it isn't. So that is one. And so that becomes the color that we imagine showing up as found footage in all kinds of, I would say, hipster works. And you're like, oh yeah, that's what. So there's that. The other is I also wanted, this is a call out to both Siddheshwari and Piyush Shah, the cinematographer, was actually sort of has had a long discussion on what happens when you start preserving something like Siddheshwari, money called Siddheshwari, which has several colors. And this is just on the edge of your decades of interest for Ranjani and Kirsty. But what for me is interesting is going to Korea. The Korean Film Council, for instance, have said, which for me was like incredibly productive, is that digital preservation is far from standardized. For me, this is always, so this is something that I have in a footnote, that it's not as if we understand one color to be the preservation. In fact, digital too has an artisanal aspect to it. So it's not the same. It's not like some code has been written and this is the only thing that's been sort of, so that is in the level of mainstream. What I also want, my particular interest, since it's in the very, very broad contemporary, which is what? Yesterday and tomorrow, and the present never really exists for the contemporary. What I want to sort of think about this as sort of two works, one really important sort of practice that is going on right now in Warsaw is Harkat, which is a small film lab. And they've been working on bathwaters over there, okay? And they've been sort of mixing, and what is weirdly interesting is that this is a generation of, I know a number of you are nodding your head, but I also find it a little weird. I said, hey, have you seen any analog films? They've never seen any analog films. What do they come from? They come from playing video games, and they told me this, and they love analog. I said, really? Do you know how expensive everything is, etc.? No, it's not expensive, because they've got artisanal, they've got like buckets out there, and they've got their sinks, and they're all processing. So I'm like, okay, way to go. But the whole idea is just across the road, they've had all the laboratories, the film laboratories that have been permanently shuttered. And here are these guys practicing. It's just kind of fun, just to see what it looks like. And this is back to what I would call the American avant-garde practices of mixing with your detergent water and mixing in mud, which is one my students have been mixing in mud. So it's like all kinds of ways in which the sacredness of analog is thrown out the window. Of course, analog is terribly expensive. That should be written as part of it. So I want to throw this off as to start thinking about technical expertise, because people get trained in different places, and we can think of whole Bombay as a center, but the film school happens to be in Pune or in Calcutta, and you also have the processing lab, and you cannot write, I'm sorry, I'm going to the last page, one cannot write the history of Bombay without writing the history of Prasad. I'm sorry. So that's sort of where it is for all of you, right? So the history of Prasad, I'm really obsessed with history of Prasad. It's sort of, I kind of think of history of Prasad as the main frontiers of, technical expertise and experiments, and they've got their own head. One small detail, I'm always kind of curious whether we ever used Fuji color. So this is always my interest. So I've asked Mohan, people who work in the Madras studios, Vasan did travel up to Tokyo, but it's never clear that they use Fuji color. So this is always a problem. Okay, this is all. Yeah, I'm curious about Fuji because this is all. I have photographs of them. It's like, oh, so did they use it? Did they not use it? And why did we never have a connection to Fuji? I'm always sort of interested in that. We should have headed off in that direction. So, and there's a longer discussion since in the 2000s, which Ranjani has interviewed, and we both sort of have our own relationship to this film, is Ashim Ahluwalia as Miss Lovely. And Ashim did shoot in Bombay, but processed it in Berlin. So, and he's sort of quite obsessed with color, but his labs are in Berlin. So if one were to take the history of laboratories, then this becomes a very, very different story altogether. So there's that issue. Okay, thank you, and that's about it.
Thank you. Preaching to the choir, Lalitha. So finally, I will invite Philip Cavendish to introduce his object for discussion.
Hi, everybody. Thanks very much to Kirsty and Ranjani for inviting me to be present here. It's a great pleasure. I'm taking us back in time to 1939, and the image that I've chosen is not really at all related to Bombay film, but it does have implications for the development of colour cinema globally, in particular, obviously, in its Soviet context, but beyond that, to the relationships that the Soviet Union had with countries after 1945, and especially those countries that gained independence. So what I'm going to do over the next 5 minutes is I'm going to explain what this image is, where it comes from. I apologise for the quality. It's the only available version of this film that we have. It was broadcast on Russian TV towards the end of the 1990s. I want to talk about the circumstances of its creation and to talk a little bit, but not very much, about the Soviet acquisition of its own colour film technology in the 1930s. And I want to raise a few issues that this film raises, and it's going to slightly pick up on what Lalitha has said already about cinematographers, laboratory processes, and so on and so forth. So this image comes from a documentary film that was called in Russian "Цветущая юность," or The Blossoming Youth, or Blossoming Young, and it was directed by Alexander Medvedkin, and it is a clip that's taken from the annual physical culture parade of the 11th of July 1939, which took place on Red Square. Now, generically, it's documentary material, but what's particularly interesting about this work is that it falls at the intersection of where documentary film meets theatrical film or costume drama. And it's largely because of the choreographing and the theatricalization of the parades itself. So what is the annual physical culture parade? Well, it's one of the key showcase events of the Soviet state during the 1930s. It's on a par with the May Day demonstrations. And it involved thousands of sports men and women, athletes from various different parts of the Soviet Union, but also representing various different sports clubs, factories, Red Army, Navy, etc., etc., etc. So it's a major showcase event, a ticketed event, in fact. You couldn't get in to see it unless you had been specially invited. The idea of the physical culture parade was to showcase the importance of physical health, athleticism, strength, the importance of youth, and also increasingly throughout the 1930s, the importance of preparedness for work and defence. In other words, defence, I'm talking about military defence. So it's a metaphor for the strength and resilience of the Soviet state, and it's a message of deterrence, not a particularly successful one, obviously, a message of deterrence to potential aggressors. It's a highly choreographed and theatricalized event which took months of preparation. The costumes, the design, the banners, the artificial flowers, it was a carnivalized event to all intents and purposes. You might regard it as the equivalent, or the historical equivalent of the sort of opening ceremony of the Olympic Games, except for the fact that the choreography, the banners, the messages have a very obvious political slant. Obviously, the opening ceremonies of Olympic Games also have a political slant, but it's an implicit political slant, if you like. It's a form of soft power, if you want to call it that, or cultural diplomacy. In the 1930s, in the Soviet Union, that message was explicit, and you can see it in the banners that are hung over various parts of Red Square and so on and so forth. In this particular case, interestingly enough, the entire event was organised around the importance of defence, bearing in mind what had taken place the previous year in Lake Hassan, otherwise known as the Changkufeng incident, which was a Japanese incursion into the Soviet Union from northeast China, which was then under Japanese control, as you probably know. And there are slogans around the stadium that allude directly to this incident. So I'm going to give it to you in Russian, and then I'm going to give it to you in English. So, работать по-стахановски, бить врагов по-хасановски. So work like a Stakhanovite, smash the enemy like a Lake Hassan border guard. That was the main slogan of the event. The incursion took place the previous year in July, August 1938, but there was also a repeat military encounter in May 1939. The image that I've chosen is of Turkmen athletes, so athletes from Turkmenistan, male athletes, and the reason that they have, if you can see, these are cotton, because that's the main export from Turkmenistan at this particular time, and Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. We'll come back to the vibrant colour of the shorts later on. But what's important to note is throughout the 1930s, the Soviet republics beyond the Russian Federation become increasingly important in terms of their participation numerically, but also theatrically, choreographically. As I say, I'll return to the costume and the colour of the costumes in a moment, but it's and the nakedness. It's surprising, actually, to see how many athletes at the end of the 1930s in Stalinist Russia divest themselves of their costumes and reveal parts of their body. Not the women athletes, of course, but the male athletes. Just briefly on the subject of colour film. So the Soviet Union develops or tries to develop its own colour film technology in the 1930s. It starts off with 2-colour, it then moves to 3-colour. It has expert scientists working on it in Leningrad, in Moscow separately. They're in socialist competition with each other. And both studios, Lenfilm and Mosfilm, produce a version of Technicolor to all intents and purposes. They denied that it was Technicolor. There is a separate story about because Technicolor, or parts of the Technicolor process were a commercial secret, were patented. There is evidence that the Soviet Union actually stole some of that information. Some of it was in the public domain. Some of it is based on principles that were very well known amongst scientific communities and amongst chemists, probably since the day that film and photography was invented. But to actually produce the machinery, first of all, the camera, the so-called 3-strip camera, which is sort of really a 2-strip camera, but a beam-splitting camera, to produce your own camera, and then the processing, which was complicated and expensive, was something that the Soviet Union never completely got to grips with, i.e. it never managed to produce multiple mass numbers of copies towards the 1930s of these films for distribution. They tend to be for niche exhibition events in the Kremlin or in 1 or 2 cinemas in Moscow or Leningrad. I'm talking about this live action film. I'm not talking about animation. That's a separate story. Interestingly enough, the real push to colour film came after the Moscow Film Festival of 1935, in which Walt Disney's 3 of Walt Disney's Technicolor animations were shown. I can't remember their names now.
Fantasy?
No, it was Three Little Pigs. I should remember that. It's fairly easy to remember. Mickey Mouse and the Bandstand was the other, and Strange Penguins. So three. And Stalin loved these films, amazingly enough. I mean, there is a separate book to be written by somebody. Maybe it's already been written about Hitler's interest in Disney and Stalin's interest in Disney. Why these two people should be interested in Disney animations is a mystery to me, but there we go. He was impressed by the technology, and it became an ideological priority or prerogative of the Soviet state to develop its own three-color method that could rival Technicolor. And this notion of technological rivalry, but also independence, is something that becomes very, very important. It's only when the Soviet Union acquires Agfacolor in 1945 as a trophy of war that the Soviet Union's color industry begins to mass produce color films. So the first films produced by the Soviet Union in the post-war period, including documentaries like Victory Parade, a great irony that the Soviet Union is celebrating its victory over Nazi Germany using a German technology that they've basically lifted, stolen from Wolfen in Eastern Germany, is a fine irony. As far as the issues relating to this particular image are concerned that it raises, first of all, the use of colourful documentary film is something that I think is interesting and by and large not neglected, because Sarah has spoken about it, for the use of coronations, for these kinds of state parades, etc., etc., etc. But it's very, very important to stress that it is not necessarily an exclusive First World issue. Colour is an attraction, but it's also a symbol of technological progress, of scientific advance, of an ability to compete with an Americanized cultural imperialism. At the same time, while this is documentary, it's not entirely documentary because, of course, it's essentially filmed theatre. That's not quite how we understand documentary. There is evidence that in the Soviet Union, colour was used, that the events were choreographed in the knowledge that they could potentially be filmed on colour film, which gave rise to increasing colorization of public life in the Stalinist period. The communist system in its Soviet manifestation and the Stalinist era in the 1930s is usually conventionally regarded as monochromatic. This is very, very mistaken. The Stalinist period from 1934-35 onwards is increasingly colorized in terms of public holidays, public festivals, fireworks, Christmas trees, increasingly colorful clothes, vibrant clothes, etc., etc., etc. And color film reflects that. And it's an important document. It has a sort of cultural value. If I could just give you a quote which gives a more political slant to this whole thing, this quote comes from Grigory Alexandrov, a film director who worked with Eisenstein in the 1920s, became an independent filmmaker, a film director in his own right in the 1930s. And he wrote as follows: he embraced colour positively and enthusiastically, unlike many of his co-directors, Eisenstein as well, who were concerned that the technology itself was not actually capable of rendering reality as accurately as he required. But anyway, Alexandrov wrote as follows: colour is essential for the expression of joyfulness and happiness. Our festivals are bright and saturated with colour. All our folk art dazzles with the richness of its palette. Colour is an essential element in the multinational art of the Soviet Union. It's important that we don't forget that the colour that's associated with the Central Asian republics is essentially a form of Russian Orientalism. In other words, colour is associated with spectacle, but it's also associated with an exotic otherness. Even though the Central Asian republics are integrated and part of the Soviet Union, they seem to be, or the people who inhabit the republics seem to be associated with vibrancy, flamboyancy, which is not necessarily the case in relation to Islamic art. The colour palettes of Islamic art are very different to this kind of flamboyancy, and neither is this vibrancy associated with the national flags or the republican flags of these republics. So it's worth noting that the Ukrainian athletes are wearing blue and yellow, which is the colour of the Ukrainian national flag. These fuchsia-coloured shorts are not related to anything. They're not related to the Central Asian art particularly. They are an invention, an imposition, which therefore becomes associated with a certain type of ethnicity, nationality, and so on and so forth. I just wanted to, I think I will stop there. There were issues that I wanted to ask you about. Just to say that the advantage of developing your own colour film technology is that you don't have to export your processing outside. So it was unthinkable in the Soviet Union that the cinematographer would not be involved in the processing, and that they would be checking the rushes on a daily basis to check that the colour film was working properly. There was a major problem in the Soviet Union in the 50s and 60s with the consistency of the colour film stocks that were brought, and cinematographers found it enormously frustrating to work with them. It could be corrected in the processing lab, but they didn't trust the laboratory processes to do it properly. So, and of course, there are all sorts of creative decisions that you take when you process colour film. You can make all sorts of adjustments. You can adjust the colour temperature, etc., etc. Although I might be corrected by the gentleman at the front here who has actual hands-on experience. But it would be unthinkable, because of the importance of cinematography as an art form, that process could be left to anybody else who wasn't involved in the actual filmmaking process. Okay, I will stop there, but thanks very much for your time.
Thanks so much, Phil. And thanks to all of our participants. We now have 45 minutes for discussion. I'm going to come and join the table. I have lots of questions, but I also don't want to take the privilege away from Ranjani if you... Okay, great, thank you. And Matt, give us a wave if you're not picking up the audio. Thank you. So I wondered if selfishly we might start with that question of processing, which I've written in my notes in inverted commas because I think there's a kind of poetic play to be had there as well, with the question of what does it mean to process another nation's cinema or another industry's cinema. And I think this is so important. It came up across these objects about this is one of the ways in which Bombay film colour is inherently globalized, is that we have this moment of domestic processing that emerges in the early 1950s, but even then, even when it's possible to process things at Film Centre, there's a question of prestige that comes with processing internationally. The question of things like widescreen, cinemascope, the other problems that throws up in terms of processing. And also the fact that these stocks are often coming in internationally, like Juvacolor coming in from Belgium. And then, to speak to Phil's presentation as well, I was thinking while you were speaking about the 1957 Indo-Soviet co-production Pardesi, which is obviously shot collaboratively with a crew from Russia and India, but is, as far as we know, processed in, we assume, Moscow.
Right.
So I sort of wanted to kind of open up a conversation about the kind of those poetic ambiguities of processing, which we might think of as a kind of like emotional and mental process, as well as a technical and material process, and just kind of like open up the conversation around that initially, because I was so interested in how that kind of continually came up, and I know it's something that Ranjani and I have also been thinking about a lot, so I wanted to kind of throw that back into the conversation if anyone wants to start.
I can say something preliminary, and then hopefully you'll have. There's several things. One is just, some of it is obviously, you all know it, but I'm just sort of repeating it. One is the industrial standard itself. So that's one thing where you can sort of standardize across countries, across filmmaking. The other is the artisanal quality. So it's like, for me, those are very, very different preoccupations, obviously, right? You can mix up and do all kinds of things at Harkat. And you can't really do that in a commercial film that is deemed, or any long feature film, forget a commercial, a feature film, okay? So there is that, there's that. color processing in of itself, and I'm also sort of have to think about this in a slightly different, because I'm also obsessed with what happened with African cinema, and John Appelmofer had spoken about this in the first decade of this century, is that most African filmmakers, and we were not at all as unlucky as African filmmakers whose films had to just be sent off to Paris, processed, and by the time it came back, you have to sort of think like, oh gee, is that my cinema? So there is that whole process that is taking place. Okay, so having said that, I feel like there are different kind of practices of color, and some you can standardize and some you cannot. So there is that. The second issue, which is why I'm not bringing up somebody like Morgan. I mean, I think of American avant-garde as like what I would call as gatekeepers on making us attentive to this. I think of Morgan Fisher's China Girl as one of the most important works for me. And it's about sort of the composition of the Indian skin. And I've seen Ranjani's presentation on color and pancake and all of that earlier. So I think that's a bit of an issue. What color is suited for an Indian skin, and whatever an Indian skin is, it's very complicated. There's an Indian skin, and then there is lighting, which are both. I mean, those are the two sort of big. The contemporary filmmakers in the digital era, especially in Tamil cinema, actually like the bright lights, and they like I've written about this in terms of thinking about it as cruel cinema, thematically, etc. So there's that kind of quality. But I do think these are like ongoing issues. And I don't know whether we've actually completely been able to resolve the idea of aesthetic and grit and all of these at the level of representation. Okay, so what does it look like perfectly, right? At that end, I mean, when it gets processed and when people start speculating on textual analysis and thinking about, I mean, that's a whole different issue. But I do think the technical stuff is, and for years and years, Hindustan Photo Films had its labs in Ooty. So there's obviously some idea that the cooler climes are good for us. So and cooler climes are also good for film shoots, and song and dance sequences can be shot there. There are all these kind of, like I would say, already with the work in Kashmir that you've done, already a sense of what I would say politics that are already in place around the notion of color. So there is that. I mean, I'm heartened by somebody like Harkat, okay? And I think because just the scale of it is kind of unruly and crazy. But I also think hand-painted and all of those things are interesting. The industrial standards, I think there's a kind of imposition. I like the story of the Soviets stealing, but I'm always suspicious since the Americans steal before everybody else. So I'm not interested. I mean, I think the Americans steal from the French permanently. That's always the long. The interwar period is how much can we steal from the French? And then the Germans, and they're Nazis, so stealing is fine.
The Nazis stole Agricolor from
the Americans steal, in other words. The Americans love stealing. So this is sort of
that's very true.
Yeah, right. So we always. I'm less interested in the Soviets sort of like working, not because there's anything bigger. It just feels like a different kind of an issue altogether. The other thing is, as much as you're focused on color, what is interesting, and this is sign of a longer conversation of what happens in the Soviet Union in the 50s and 60s. I mean, especially the 60s, the thaw period, is that there is color, as in India. There's still black and white. Black and white doesn't leave. So we actually have to think of black and white also as a color. There's sort of long sort of grays, etc. So I don't want to give up black and white. In the digital era, we call it monochromatic. And we sort of say, oh, that shot is monochromatic. Like, what's that monochromatic? So I think I don't want to give up the idea that we have a certain attachment. And the Soviet thaw period, if you think about it, they're all in black and white. They're like gorgeous. So then it's like then the garishness belongs to the color, but why don't we have black and white? So I think it's just the more scholarship there is, then the filmmakers hear us, and then there's a kind of conversation that will end up happening in some cinemas that has been possible, right? And so color doesn't have to always be fuchsia, which is so beautiful, but also so awful when it cannot be preserved.
Which I think that actually one of the big words, the key words I wrote down was quality. And I noticed how many people apologise for the quality of their slides. And I kind of would love to have a little discussion about this and this question of preservation of what does it mean to do a history of colour cinema from these poor quality copies, and how does that throw up methodological issues, particularly for some of us who are used to writing on histories of Technicolor, which is beautifully preserved. I'd love to hear folks speculate on that as well, because I think you bring up such an interesting question there around kind of preservation and standardization, processing and standardization, and then also working from these really degraded copies. So I'll throw that back out as well.
I would just start from working on early cinema was where I began, and when I started doing that work 20 years ago, there was this, what you get your hands on, what you could see was varied quite a bit, especially in video copies. Like you're coming out of, stuff that was transferred to safety prints that was then digitized from that. And so you're just I was trained to see variable and variation and to try to, imagine what these colors might have looked like. And then, at the same time I was working with nitrate, so I had access, probably privileged access to material that was pristine and amazing to see. But you could, that kind of awareness of variability was built into my methodology from the get-go. What you're asking is also something different though, because looking in particular at Geva color, that's something that from the get-go was varied and was, again, shot to shot, shots within the shot, you would see the color shifts, particularly at the end of a shot. And so, it wasn't pristine from the get-go. And so the video copies that come down to us through various sources that we don't know where they're coming from, who's transferring them, what they are necessarily. It's guesswork at a certain level, but it's also guesswork that you triangulate with, I would say. And it's and again, thinking of Joran Portvi's article, it's not, we're not looking necessarily for the, images that take your breath away. They're there and they come up, but also that kind of wrestling with imperfect technologies, to go to the language of third cinema, the imperfection is something to be thought through strategically here. I'll stop at that point.
Can I just say briefly?
Oh no, I was just going to say that, I think we always have to work with variability, and it's also there very much at the level of projection. And I think all you can do is research the provenance of whatever you're working with and declare that up front, and be aware that once these things are out in the world, there is this variability, not least in terms of how we see and how we look and we interpret. There's that at the level of reception, that there's a lot of variation too. So this idea that there's this pure original,
the pure one,
even with the pristine Technicolor, is perhaps a bit of a myth. And I know we moved on a little bit from processing, but I just wanted to add a little bit about the importance of these. Impact perhaps of the natural resources like water and local exploit, and this whole idea, certainly in terms of British Technicolor, was that somehow the processing with the water in the UK made the prints look different, from people saying that's why they look very different from US. And again, what is that? Is that a myth? Is that, what's the science behind that? Is it, do these local variables really create a trace and how can we sort of understand that? I just wanted to throw that in as something kind of interesting that's always followed me around any discussion around processing.
Yeah, the idea there's a kind of terroir for processing.
Indeed, yeah.
Phil, sorry, you were going to.
I was just going to say, actually, in response to what you just said, Joshua, that actually right now my sense is the problem is not imperfection, but over-perfection. Because digital restoration has reached a kind of astonishing degree of sort of breathtaking beauty. I was, before I wrote the Thor piece for your edited volume, I was watching a 4K restoration of Sergei Parajanov's Arabesques on a theme of Pirosmani, and that's a film that I remember seeing in the Scala flea pit near King's Cross in around 1984. And this digital restoration is just so beautiful, it made me cry, literally. But it's not what I watched. And so this question now is that the digital restoration process is a subjective process. It's not based, or it depends on who's undertaking it and the degree of rigor with which they're doing it. But they have nothing to go back to. I mean, once upon a time, previous generation, you would work with the cinematographer, but even the cinematographer only has a memory of the moment of filming, and that memory is invariably likely to be subjective. And so you get these astonishing, ravishing restorations which actually reflect our aesthetic sensibilities today. They're great to watch, you know, and they're wonderful experiences. But as you say, what are we going back to? Well, we don't know what we're going back to. Certainly, some of the Soviet films of the 1960s and 70s that I've seen, the film stock, they're rotten. Really, really miserable. They were pretty miserable actually when they were released, because Soviet film stock was so unreliable and people hated working with it. It didn't have the sensibility. There's a big argument about Eastman colour versus Soviet film stock, with some film cinematographers saying they much preferred to work with Eastman colour because you could work with shadow areas, you could get detail in shadow, there was less sense of light with block. I mean, I'd be interested to know how this works with Bombay colour as well. So it's not just about processing, it's about the aesthetics of colour at the point of filming. In other words, what are they seeking? The other thing, of course, is all the costumes that we use. Presumably, they're made from dyes. Dyes fade. So we don't know what we're going back to in terms of the original costumes either, which is picking up something actually you were saying about your interest in costumes historically. So I don't know where that sort of leaves us.
I think what's also interesting and kind of ties those things together, and I'll also hand over to Ranjani so I'm not hogging the questions, was the interesting comment you made, Lalitha, about contemporary filmmakers trying to replicate the look of celluloid through the magenta look that we associate with degraded celluloid. So thinking that, you know, Bombay colour looks like that kind of magenta bias that you get in degraded things like degraded chromogenic monopacks, Jiva colour, usually low quality ones, and also early Eastman colour, right? So it's interesting that the digital look is echoing that kind of poor quality look that emerged from some of these issues that we're tracing. Ranjani, I don't want to sort of dominate.
No, I actually want to take the discussion to something else which I noticed through the presentations. We went through the material object, material culture, cultural history, political history, technological history, the discussion on national cinema versus regional cinema in the case of how Shantaram's journey was mapped out, and Lalitha kept reprimanding us for not paying enough attention to Prasad laboratory, and the Soviet history linked to documentary and the public parade, where you actually have a political analysis of color as performance and how that sort of goes back to choreography and staging events. And so the Stalin era becomes about color becoming the vehicle through which you're actually announcing to the world a certain prowess that you have
and also,
at that point. So in this whole thing, color is a kind of technology that everybody is dying to have, and the multiple nodes through which it's moving. You're moving from country to country. Technology is moving from one part of the world to the other, and climate conditions play such a major role. And so I wanted to ask this question. We are talking about decay. We are talking about degraded images. Things fade over time. Methodologically, what does this do to the way in which we address color? When color becomes an arc, it opens out so many interesting questions. And yet this whole natural world history is so central to the way in which we have to access this past. How do we tackle this? And maybe the audience can also come in here and ask certain questions, it will also help us go into the next session where after lunch we have the next session. But this question of thinking about color as an arc, as a historical engagement with the history of color and what it does to different ways in which we have thought of cinema. It's like it's the new object that is allowing us to enter a field that has established itself without thinking of color. And when we enter that space, decay, degradation, and the faded image is very central to the way we are accessing this material. So climate conditions play a very important role. And this then becomes a question for all of us. I never paid attention to this until I started going to Bombay, talking to Mr. Nirgulkar and all the people in the labs and the problems they were talking about. And I suddenly realized, how can we divorce the aesthetic question from what climate was doing to the process? Yeah. Because this is absolutely central to how we think about these questions. So just some thoughts on this from all of you, because you brought so many different things together. You were connecting different things, and whether this Phil apologized for the poor quality of the image. Lalitha remarked about the magenta and Sarah, and so this is something that we talking about red leaking as well. And what does it do to the aesthetic dimension? Some thoughts on this.
Let me throw one thing out about processing that it's in my head and I don't quite know what to do with it, but it also dovetails with these questions about climate and water and temperatures. But my understanding from the work of Josie Dickey on Agricolor and then also Heather Heckman on Eastman Color was a particular kind of shift around IP, intellectual property, that Eastman Color especially kind of pushed in the post-war period during the 60s and 70s, where they didn't protect the formulas for processing. They wanted adoption. They encouraged labs to take up their formulas around the world, and this is part of their success story in the post-war period that just eventually displaces Agricolor for a variety of reasons, but that it wasn't protective at that level. That they wanted labs founded that could process Eastman Color. They didn't want to control it and have it centralized. They did centralize their production of their stocks, but the processing they wanted to be global. And it was successful at that level. How that, though, gets adopted around the world with different climates, different temperatures, it seems to be the real one of the questions that we're butting up against. And I'd love to kind of know more about that specific history. But and again, just to kind of it's a shift from Technicolor's like self-processing and dye transferring and setting up their own labs that they control around the world to anybody can set up the lab if they have the know-how, the money, the resources, which isn't easy. But the processing is public at a certain level. And so that's just kind of one thing that I've been kind of floating in my head.
We just interviewed a cinematographer, Anil Mehta, Kirsty, Purvi and I, and he said, why doesn't the color never looks the same as when it's processed elsewhere in the world?
Yeah.
Something goes wrong in India. And then he gave us, of course, a layered history of why and what happens. And but this is a refrain. It's not something that doesn't exist. And it's something to think about. And I'm sure India's is not the only story here. I'm sure in other parts of the world you have the same kind of story that we don't really still know about.
Well, it's because go on. It's because colour's always an imperfect process and always has been, and even digital colour is imperfect. I mean, if you film on your phone or you film on a mini digital camera, you're not the lens is not seeing what you see with your eye. Reds are hopeless. There's overcompensation all the time. You have to sort of really work hard in post-production to restore what you think you saw. And at different stages in the history of colour film, I'm talking about analogue, at different stages that problem has been incredibly severe. Right at the very beginning when we talked about skin colour, that was a major, major problem. But just to briefly respond to this question about climate, it's about the relationship. It's about finding sunlight. In the Soviet Union, anyway, it's about going to places where there is sufficiently strong sunlight to register images satisfactorily on the colour film stock that they're working with at the time, which is why it pushes them further and further out from the centre to warmer climates, drier climates, and the landscapes and peoples of those climates. It's a very, very interesting phenomenon. So it's the colour film stock itself determines, first of all, in the early period, subject, who is filmed. One of the early two-colour Technicolor films, or part of, is called Redskins, so it's based on Native American Indian, and so on and so forth. I guess it's only relatively recently, since we've moved to digital, that there's been a great shift in terms of post-production, so you can practically do anything. I mean, don't quote me on that, because we have specialists in the audience, but you can more or less do anything you like. The question is, to what extent is it related to what you actually thought you were filming at the time?
Yeah,
But-
I have. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, go on.
Sorry, because I was, you know how it is. You sort of pick up on the last slide. The best was like, no. So I'll just sort of keep trying. So the question of the elemental, which I'm sort of interested in from the space of cinematography, I've written about it, so I'll begin there, which I feel can focus myself a little better. The Steadicam, which I've written about in Bombay, the Steadicam 1 did not work in India because of tropical conditions, so it was only the Steadicam 2. This is, I've already written, so this is all part of like the, so that was the one, because the conditions in India did not make that possible for it to function properly. But the next Steadicam 2 did. One of the things that we should consider, and I'm responding and then I have my own point on this matter, is the question of the elemental at two different levels. One is, of course, as I've just said, the equipment itself. The second part is something that Sarah had brought up earlier, which is about water, etc. And I do think, unlike Joshua's thing that they were standardized, etc., which I do believe, I think most American companies, since I live in America and so do you, I feel quite critical about the system. I do think they don't tell us everything about, so there's a certain kind of IP patent right, so that's why it looks different. It's standardized, that's why, I mean, people like Anand Mehta, and I know Hariharan, whose father was the Eastman Kodak Krishnan. There's a kind of, they just keep one thing away. That's part of IP. You keep one thing to yourself, so that it's so-called open source, but it's really not. And then everything has to, so I think everything has to be sort of jerry-rigged in just a manner so it looks different. So I'm always sort of, I'm never, like Kodak is a big company, there's one. The other is I did my PhD at Rochester where Kodak situated. The waters get so badly, the groundwater is completely polluted thanks to these great photochemical industries, which we all love. But remember, the polluting waters are very, very serious. There's one. On the other hand, with digital, the cooling towers of preservation are so, I mean, nothing short of encroachment. So I don't know how one balances these two out completely, right? So you've got the analog pollution, which you can get carcinogenics, and you get a different kind of carcinogenic with digital. So these are the two sort of, the third thing, which I'm sort of still interested, and I continue, several cinematographers who moved from black and white, who had masters in Indian cinema, who are considered to be amazing, they're hopelessly bad with color photography. And this is like a real issue. I mean, including the great ones whose names I cannot take right now. I mean, of the period, 50s and 60s, who are celebrated black and white cinematographers. You watch them in color, they're like, I don't know what they are. They're like, Murti, like, you know, like, that's what I mean. I don't want to, the gods will fall. But, you know, these are folks like, what are they, amateur color? So in a way, so there is that. The other is the interference of websites like YouTube and all of these websites. They preserve the degradation at a particular point. So that's where the fuchsia. It's not as if things get permanently degraded, right? I mean, they're not. And the other thing to accept, which sound recorders will, the minute of film which has been mixed for sound leaves the lab, it's already lost. So we have to assume that the luminosity, thanks to cheap and inexpensive or overused projection lights, that the film will actually deteriorate, and that can be part of the pleasure of watching. And we can't do it. We're just being sort of wonderfully fussy and meticulous, but it would be like, okay, I'm going off to see a film at Sterling, and it's at the 100th day, which we celebrate as the 100th day of box office when we watch an analog film, but we can also say the 100 days of the film being deteriorated. So the soundtrack is just going to move just so, and then there's going to be grain on it, and that's part of it. Of course, the digital era is a whole other thing, right? You're almost seeing the same thing. So material conditions are so complicated. The idea is methodologically, right? I mean, what do you do? Like, how do we hold ourselves as you follow? And I like what you're proposing, but you follow something from back to front or from front to back. So that's the idea. The finished product, which you might admire, and then you find out that finished product that you admire might be shot by the great cinematographer, great director, script, and then you find out it's no different from that tawdry little film that did really badly at the box office, right? So they're pals that you never expected, all bathed in that same water. So there is that. I mean, I want that as well, right? I mean, a kind of reclassification of color processing canons in different ways.
I mean, maybe there's a sort of case for, I know this sounds, for working with multiple versions, as it were, or with multiple renditions of this thing that is particular film we're analysing, and at the level of reading, being able to sort of discern maybe difference but also similarity, trying to explain that, so that the life of the film as a sort of a material object that was shot, yes, prepared, shot, pre-production, but then post, that the stages of its life as a material object before it gets released and is absorbed by audiences can actually be, tracked. And it's just, perhaps it's around a sensitivity to that and an awareness that that is part of the film's life in the world, and that this, how can we talk about it, how can we articulate it at the level of discussion, how do we find the language, do we need to expand our vocabulary about how we describe colour, different cultural meanings around colour and what that means. I think that could actually be quite liberatory in terms of how we analyse films with colour in mind. Because Ranjani, you were talking about, for years people didn't even, they said, black and white colour. There wasn't any fine-grained work done around that area. But I'm quite excited about the prospect of this opening up a terrain of not just technical analysis and industrial analysis and the processing and all of that, which is so important, but how to sort of link that with what we do with texts and how we create understanding and how we try to discuss them within certain ideological, methodological, conceptual frameworks that sort of bring out this material life of the film. I think that's a really exciting space that I think all of you have raised.
I wanted to just come. Are we?
I was going to say, given we've got 15 minutes, I wondered if we might take the opportunity out to the audience. I've got a roving mic. Would anyone like to pose a question or respond to any of the questions that have been asked already? So if you could speak into that. And then could someone who's near Matt's microphone repeat the question, because he will be picking up this audio for get technical.
Okay, I just want to make some observations about various things that were discussed. First was about perfection in restoration. I agree with you totally. And one example was someone who was very knowledgeable, saw Manthan, which we're going to see tomorrow, and said that the trees were too green, but anyone knowing Gujarat in the summer, they should have been dusty. So actually, it's a very valid point, because there is all virtually colorization more than restoration in many cases. Second point was about Pakiza, which I thought very interesting that you are looking at that film, and the whole question of her feet and as you know, the bleeding meant the blood, and the blood means she's his cousin. So he didn't marry he married his cousin in the end. The big question I want to find out, I haven't found out yet, maybe Rosie would know. When Kamal Amrohi made this film, which was 12 years before its release, did he start in black and white? And then we could see what adjustments he made. I sent a message to his grandson, black and white. He has to ask his aunt and his father, which was 80s, and find out, because I doubt there's even a single green left, but it would be very interesting. About one more point about Pakiza is that when I had helped the screening, the outdoor screening in Bombay, do you go?
I didn't actually, but it sounds wonderful.
And the colour has a bit very uneven and all of that. And the biggest problem I found was that Meena Kumari's makeup was so bad that dated the film more than the sets and everything else. The close-ups and the makeup was a real issue. And if we look at the Indian films, even Sangam or Raj Kapoor, you'll see that Rajendra Kumar's face is made up, but his neck isn't. So he's got a white powdery face and a dark neck. So these are the things. And just to be, last point is about the process and processing. I have been working around Indian film very closely with production companies for 20 years. And I have never known anybody not to send the DOP or the director himself to approve every shot grading. So it isn't that the lab decides, the lab does not decide. And in the old days, I'm sure they were even more particular, and now they are very particular, even when working with digital. There's no question of anyone else deciding. They wouldn't pay the bill. So I don't think we should just assume the lab has that much authority.
Do you want me to repeat the questions? I mean, that was
Yes, hopefully that's going to pick up on the ambient audio through the mic, so yeah,
We got a thumbs
I think
up.
we'll be okay.
Yeah, go ahead. Anyone?
Well, thank you for bringing up Pakisa. Yes, so fascinating. I have got, there's quite a good book sort of that has discussed the various stages of its production. You might well know it. And I wasn't aware that there was any black and white footage shot. So it seems to be Eastman colour from a fairly early stage, even though the whole thing took a long time to make.
But you're talking about starting production in 61 and
Yeah.
52.
Yes.
Meena Kumari was working in black and white.
Yeah,
society,
yeah.
And Kamal Saab wasn't like Mehboob who could afford Technicolor at
Yeah,
that time.
yeah. But on the credits, there's somebody called Ivory Bedos, who's credited as a colour consultant. And I haven't been able to find out much about this. It just comes up in connection with that film. But if anybody, I'd be fascinated to know what that meant, what that actually meant for that film. And if has anybody been able to actually find something out? I would love to know. Oh, look, two hands have gone up. How exciting. Yeah.
In addition, in that Pakiza context,
Yes.
a lot of the sets of Pakiza are also inspired by Amroha, where Kamal Amrohi is from.
Yes.
So
The sets are amazing.
when
Yeah.
you go into Amroha, there's this beautiful Haveli, which is like his house.
Ah, yes.
And you think you've seen it before. We went on a recce and I was like, I've seen this place before. But you realize that he's taken that idea from that Haveli and the arches and the doorway, which is kind of completely disintegrating. But he's taken that idea and he's put it into the film. So there's a lot from that mango growing sugar area. The Pankaj Bhutalia's film was shot and we went to shoot another film there. We kept looking at these places and they looked familiar and he's used that context into the film. Just in addition.
Oh, thank you.
art-wise.
Yes, yes.
There was somebody there.
Yes.
Yes.
Come closer and then I'll go back to the back.
Yeah, really fascinating that you chose Pakiza. Two things I'd like to add to that. The cinematographer was Josef Wilsching, but he died in 1967, so he didn't complete the filming. And I don't know, that it isn't listed who the other cinematographers were who took over, but I have read in the past that you could tell the period when Wilsching was making it and when the others were doing it afterwards, because it was not so, the colour quality wasn't as good. But the other thing I'd say is that because it took so long to make, during that period, Meena Kumari was becoming more and more ill.
Yes. She died quite soon after it was released. Yeah.
And in the dance scene where she sits on the floor and the dancers are going around her, that was also because she could no longer get up and do the dance. So that was obviously quite late in the film.
She was a terrible dancer.
Thank you so much. This is so fascinating. I have a question and also just a contribution to the conversation about Pakiza. I'm so glad. I was born in '78 and I kind of grew up on a VHS cassette.
Oh yeah.
That I was sort of presented with as an old movie. I sort of imagined it as an old movie, but I was watching it, and because it was such a bad VHS copy, I didn't notice any of the things you mentioned at all. And I just thought it was worth mentioning that. I also knew Pakiza because of movie Meher. And so in terms of imperfection, I experienced it as a long-running kind of feature on a VHS cassette, but also with like interval breaks on TV. And I think that was worth thinking about as well, because is quite a long movie. So that's just my contribution about Parkiza. But I had a question, sort of picking up on things that all of you sort of mentioned, but specifically Philip mentioned Eisenstein's reluctance to use black and white because he felt it was less realistic than what black and white chiaroscuro was kind of capable of. And I was wondering if the panelists could talk a bit about this dichotomy between fantasy and reality, or the commitment to capturing reality between the use of colour and black and white for filmmakers, specifically with Wizard of Oz in mind.
Do you want me to respond to that initially? So Eisenstein was shown various fragments of film, Soviet film, and also foreign film in 1940, and he was working on various colour projects that he wanted to explore. One of them was A Life of Pushkin. And he decided that the quality of the colour was simply insufficient for any kind of film that was purported to have some kind of realistic basis, because the colour was distorted. So when he eventually made the section of Ivan the Terrible Part 2, which is in colour, in Agricolor, he used colour symbolically rather than realistically. And so my impression of the early use of colour, because of its brightness, it tended to be used for certain types of generic material. It was used for spectacle, or it's used for dance, for highly theatrical works, where colour, in particular very, very bright colour, could be accepted as a kind of artistic conceit, poetic conceit. And it's also used for fantasy sequences and dreamlike sequences. Actually, Gone with the Wind, and I'm struggling to remember, is probably one of the first full-length features where colour is some kind of realistic use of colour is sort of attempted, and the sort of influence of the Technicolor advisor Natalie Kalmus is sort of, her input, as I understand it, is sort of limited. But as we move into the Thaw era, it was definitely, in the Soviet Union, it was felt that black and white was more authentic and more realistic, as paradoxical as that might seem, and that if you wanted to analyse critically the society in which you lived, black and white was the way to do it. Colour was not realistic. So.
Lalitha, you wanted to...
Yeah, respond to two things. Yeah, I mean, the discussion on black and white, which so the grey, which is sort of part of film noir as well, and this has been written about the French critics on how we can't think of film noir as just film noir as film grey. So you get that. The other thing is, to you, Moni, what is interesting, I agree DOPs tend to supervise, but I'm particularly attached to digital intermediaries, the people, the row of assistants who actually sit there. A number of cinematographers just use their cell phones. When they get the contemporary digital, they just look at it and say, okay, it's for ad films. They say, oh yeah, this is fine, let it go, they fly. But I love these kind of unacknowledged artists, these digital intermediaries who are sitting in these offices, at these consoles and adjusting, and they're the ones finally coaching and instructing the cinematographer who had been trained at some school at FTI in analog as the only standard, and then suddenly they're sort of introducing them, and these guys get nothing. Ashirvad and people like Prime Focus, oh yeah, something. They're like rows of them, and we should say this even for the big blockbusters of American digital films which come out, right? Whether it be Sinners or whether it's Avatar, James Cameron, when you see all these coders, you see like millions of coders, they have some sense of this color. And as we're talking about color, right, we do know there's a new color on the spectrum.
Oh, yes.
That's like I feel like, what does it look like? It's like, oh, what does it look like? So there's a new color on the spectrum. So there's that as well, which I don't think would have happened without the intervention of digital technology. In a way, it's an overdetermined moment to sort of think, oh, there's a new color on the spectrum, which I believe we cannot discern, or it cannot be reproduced in our, it's all kinds of complications. Like, what is that color? So it's a very particular kind of a color. That is there. So anyway, there's a lot to be said.
I agree with you, but the colorist in a post-production is working with a paint box. He can paint any section he wants. Yep. Whereas a DOP or a director who's shooting does not have access. He can't suddenly change this color of the sofa. whereas the colorist can. So the colorist does, as you say, should be acknowledged greatly, but then you're dependent on someone's aesthetics. What if they are very garish, or they are overdoing it, or they're underdoing it? So it's a paint box they're working with. You know, I go with a shot and they can paint any section. Like today, all the movie stars, not all, but some of them, all their faces are being reworked. They're made thinner. That's not what they look like in front of the camera. So there is all that question of colorists and what access to technology they have in relation to the cameraman and the film director. This is it's a different story than you give it over to a kid and he paints in the color.
I think this is a really, really good segue into what's going to be our after-lunch conversation with Mr. Nugroka about the technical process of processing film. In the interest of actually giving everyone a full hour's break for lunch, I'm going to ask you to thank our participants. Thank you.